I wish Rick could be here tonight. I would so love him to know that his book had been specifically chosen for republication among several possibilities by an admiring fellow writer, Renee Denfeld. That finally his longest term wish to have his book taken up by a publisher had come true. Rick became fascinated with the mystery, to him, of the people who, as he put it, used to live around here. And he did most of his original research well before I met him in 1985. Besides his pursuit of any written references he could find, he wanted to learn about these people by doing some of the things they did, experiencing the rigors of a spirit quest, seeking and trying the native foods like wapato, and especially canoeing, notching his paddles as they did to see how they helped maneuver. He often recited some of their myths he had found, and many were about Coyote, whom Rick came to identify with.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody here to hear a little bit about Rick Rubin. Rick Rubin, a personal friend of many of us, and a literary and significant cultural figure in the world of Portland, going back to the early post-war period, into the, even early 40s, 50s, 60s. But by the time he's into the 60s, he's already somebody who's writing here, primarily making that his living, has chosen, having gone to college, to come back to live in Portland. Rick is truly a person of this place. He was somebody who drew together people because he knew something about the Northwest spirit. He was an emblem in some ways for many of us of this creative, sometimes a little bit cantankerous side that really did see something special here. Too often we're driven to think of all creative energy being gathered in those epicenters that include Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. But Rick understood and exemplified, as I say, the sense that it's happening here too, that we can make it happen here too, and he suddenly found himself in time after time being parts of a cohesive community that he was often the glue for. One of the things that Rick did in his person and his writing was to explore the real crafts and talents of people who lived in this frequently resource-based world. He loved the forest, he loved the sea and the waterways of our place, and he was somebody who really brought a lot to that, and he investigated it. And from early on he understood that we couldn't truly understand this place without understanding our forebears. Not just those people who had explored here, but the Chinook people specifically and their descendants who had first made this a really significant home for themselves, that had lived off the bounty of this land. Rick understood that this was a bountiful place that needed to be protected, nurtured, and so he started endeavoring to really understand what was possible here, and those people who had first defined this as a comfortable, wonderful, sometimes contentious place to live. One of the things that Rick did after he really understood that there was a need for a resource to help people understand the first people of this place was to create a wonderful book, Naked Against the Rain, the people of the lower Columbia River. And it was the world of people before the white explorers and settlers came. He was trying to capture that last period of time when this was truly an independent people occupying a space that gave them a rich and abundant life.
I'm going to start by reading a passage from, a couple of passages from Naked Against the Rain that sort of follow on what Charlotte was reading. And then I'll talk a little bit about working with Rick on making this book. There are a couple of things in here that I'll just say ahead of time. you'll hear early on a reference to Big River, and Big River was the Columbia. And there was also a reference later on to the Dalles, but it's not to the city of the Dalles, which would not exist until much, much later, after the American settlers had arrived, but to the geological feature where the Columbia River was extremely narrow. There was a place just on the east side of the Cascades, but west of Celilo Falls, where the river was really a channel cut through the basalt, and it was only 200 feet wide, although it was several hundred feet deep. So the fishing was really good there. So that was the Dalles of the Columbia. It was along with Celilo Falls. It was part of the 10,000-year-old native fishing grounds that was drowned when the Dalles Dam was built and completed in 1957. So this is from early on about the salmon and the sustenance that they offered the people. Once the salmon arrived, the people's troubles would be over. If they observed the taboos, first salmon would come from his house at the bottom of the sea, leading countless ignat, their word for fish in general, or Chinook salmon in particular. The species has also been called tai, king, granat, or blackmouth salmon. Ignat offered their luscious pink flesh freely to the people, but should the fish be insulted or mistreated, they would cease to come. No man caught ignat or anything else unless they were willing to be caught. A man who boasted of how many he would catch caught none, perhaps even died. A man who observed the taboos established a mutual regard between himself and the beings he fed upon. 5 kinds of salmon swam up Big River, each in its season, each heading for ancestral spawning beds. The first run of ignat went up as early as February or March. These spring salmon ascended the Cowlitz, Sandy, and Willamette rivers. They leapt 41-foot Willamette Falls, surmountable only in the spring, when the Willamette's flow was high and the water below the falls was backed up by the flooding Columbia. The Clackamas and Clawawalla who lived there fished with conical dip nets, 10 feet in depth and 4 or 5 feet wide at the mouth, with 30-foot handles. They built wooden platforms out over the water and netted fish as they fell back from leaping or rested in an eddy. The fish jumped 15 feet, then swam up the rest of the way. Only 1 leap in 10 succeeded. A man with a dip net could take 20 in an hour, averaging 40 pounds or more each. Again the cry was heard, "They come, ignat," and someone landed the first one, which made him lucky all year, and the site where he caught it, lucky too. He invited the rest of the people who came to his home where he performed the ritual. Chinook ceremonies were not so complex, and every man knew them. They needed no priesthood to interfere for them with a distant, all-powerful god. The fishermen ritually cleaned and cooked the fish and made special distribution to old people and children. Then everyone passed around the fish and took a piece. They disposed of the remains in a manner pleasing to the spirit salmon. And then a little bit later in the book, the women's food technology was far from simple. Camas bulbs, one of their staples, were first roasted for 48 hours in an underground oven, which produced a sweet black mush. This they pounded into a dough shaped into large loaves, wrapped in grass and steamed. They then broke each loaf up and refashioned the material into smaller cakes, which they dried under the sun. Camas cakes stayed sweet through the winter. They sliced them like English plum pudding. They mashed, steamed, dried, ground, and roasted, made fruit leathers, soaked some things in oil, rotted others, brined them, stored them in boxes, stored them in holes in the ground, hung them, smoked them, and performed other preparations. Itkalak, dried and pounded salmon, took great effort. First they exposed ignat salmon to the sun until the skin slipped easily off, then stripped the meat from the bones and mashed it fine. They spread the rich pink flesh 3 or 4 inches deep on a mat for several days. It dried quickly in the parched air above Wind Mountain, east of the Cascades. They crumbled it again and, adding a little water, squeezed it through their hands until it was a homogeneous mass, which they spread out to dry again. Next they added steelhead oil and sometimes dried berries, and having lined their special 1-foot by 2-foot baskets with dried and stretched salmon skins, they rammed the dried fish meal in as tight as they could with 3-foot-long black basalt pestles, which came to be called salmon packers. They left such baskets of fish meal standing around in the open at the Dalles with just a mat over them, or buried them in the ground. Even so, Itkalak lasted several years, unlike ordinary smoke drying, which preserved fish only for a season, 1 winter at most. They nibbled a little of the sawdust-like fish meal or used it for soup stock. it was powerfully nourishing. It was also a triumph of pre-industrial technology that should not be underestimated. So that's Rick. I first met Rick in the early 90s when he was on the board of the Oregon Cultural Heritage Commission, and I was doing some projects for them, and so I ended up going to several of their board meetings. And Rick and I took a liking to each other, and we would end up chatting sometimes after these meetings. And at some point he said to me, I have this manuscript I've been working on. I'd really like you to take a look at it and see what you think. And the work that I do, I design and produce books for people, mostly for nonprofit organizations, but also sometimes for individuals. And I get a lot of these kinds of requests. Would you take a look at this manuscript? And I said, sure, I'll take a look at this manuscript. And it turns out to be just brilliant. I mean, it was so powerful. And Rick told me the story of how he came to write it, which was that he was looking for information for an article that he was writing, and he went looking for the book about the people who used to live here, and he couldn't find the book. And so he kept looking, and finally he decided he had to write the book. And so he did. And so he showed me this manuscript, and I said, this is terrific, but, it's kind of long. Self-publishing is a little bit of a risky business. You should find a publisher. And it turned out that he had been submitting it to academic publishers. There used to be a number of academic publishers in this region. There aren't so many now, but one of them was Oregon Historical Society had a press. There were other places that had presses, U of O, that don't exist anymore. And essentially he had the book, he had submitted it to academic publishers, and they would do what they are pleased to call peer review, which is to send it out to people to review it and decide whether it's worthy of publication. My own view is that there was no real peer for this book, but in any case, they put it out for peer review, and they would say, well, it's a wonderful book, but the author doesn't have a PhD, and so it would be inappropriate for us to publish it. And that was pretty much how I understood it. And at one point, one of these academic publishers said, well, why don't you, if we were going to publish it, it would have to have footnotes that show that all of this stuff is true as far as you know, and it would have to have a bibliography, it would have to have an index. And so Rick went back and did all that stuff and brought it back to them, and they said, but you still don't have a PhD, so we're not going to publish it. So finally Rick said, okay, I've put, by one calculation that he made, he put 8 full years of his life into researching and writing this book at that point. And he said, the hell with it, I just want to go ahead and make the book, and will you help me with that? So a lot of the books that I do for individuals are books of poetry. There may be 60 pages at most. They're paperback, they're 500 copies or something like that, but this is a 430 plus page hardcover book. It's a real investment to decide to self-publish that, and there's no real easy way to get it out into the world. But this is 1999. Internet wasn't what we know it is today. There was no social media. There was really difficult without a distributor, without a publisher, to move a book out into the world. And so we ended up making 2,000 books because that's where we could get the price point down to $30, which was what felt like the maximum that we could sell the book for. Rick could sell the book for. Rick was as you've seen, Rick was a very visual person. He was a terrific writer, but he also, as a very visual person, he thought a lot about how he wanted the book to look. He had commissioned someone to do a cover painting. He had found the photographs and other images and drawn some of the images that are chapter openings in the book. And he'd really thought about this a lot. So although I did the actual design, it was really very much of a collaborative effort between the two of us. We worked back and forth a lot, so I don't really take as much credit for this as I normally would, but it was important to him that it read the way he wanted to, that it looked the way he wanted it to on the page, so we worked really well together. We ended up making 2,000 hardcover books. It's a lot of money. We're kind of apprehensive about it. More apprehensive, I think, ahead of time. Rick was more apprehensive when the 2 pallets of books showed up on Irving Street, and they had to hand carry them in and put them in the entryway to their house. And then they had stacks and stacks and stacks of books. And so it's daunting. How are you going to market this thing? So we talked to Tom Booth, who is at that point the marketing director for Oregon State University Press, and now the associate director of that press. And Tom had a number of suggestions, but one of them was, he said, you know Jonathan Nicholas, why don't you talk to Jonathan about maybe mentioning the book in a column? And Jonathan at that point had a column 3 days a week, I think something like Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, sort of the same frequency that the entire paper is published now. But at the time, he had this column that was published 3 times a week, and it would be a series of, little anecdotes about different things going on around town, 6 or 8 or a dozen different things. So we sat down, Jonathan was very gracious, and he sat down in my studio, and we talked to him about the book and gave him a copy, and it seemed to go pretty well, and we thought, well, okay, so maybe we'll get one of those little mentions in one of those columns. And then, much to our astonishment and amazement, he devoted an entire Sunday column, which you've already seen put up there on the screen, titled Rick Rubin's Labor of Love, Read It and Weep. And it was apparent from the review, which Carrie Timchuk quoted, that Jonathan had actually read the book and that he had just gotten why this book was such an important book to be published. And as David mentioned, that really moved books out the door. Jonathan had been so kind as to include Rick and Charlotte's address and the cost of the book, and so people were sending checks to their house and buying the book directly instead of going to bookstores, which for a self-publisher is a huge deal. Instead of getting 40%, you're getting 100%. Rick, then after the hardcover had sold out, people were still saying, well, I'd like to buy this book, I'd like to buy this book, and there weren't any. And there was some talk of putting it into a form for paperback. Someone said that I mushed it into a paperback form, and it's not really the technical term that we typically use in the trade, but Rick and I spent some time. There are some aspects of the book which are there's a map in the original hardcover. There's a map on the end paper, and it's repeated on the front and back end papers, and so there's a question of how do you put that inside the book, where do you put that? There were other considerations I won't bore you with, but so Rick and I spent a bunch of time thinking about how a paperback would look as he tried to interest publishers still in publishing a paperback. And then Rick became ill, and that idea sort of went away. And then after Rick had died, Charlotte and I started talking about, well, how would you make a paperback? And I said, well, we've got the ability to do that. There's some things that aren't resolved, but most of the things are resolved. And so we were having these discussions, and I was pretty anxious about Charlotte having to underwrite this paperback book and have those stacks of boxes in her living room again and worrying about whether she could sell the paperback. And then, like a deus ex machina, a really literal deus ex machina here, Charlotte calls me up and says, I had a call from this publisher, and he's interested in reprinting Naked Against the Rain, and would you talk to him? So I went and looked at some of Pharos Edition's books, and they have a very specific template and a very specific typography, and it's very different from what Naked Against the Rain looks like. And I called up Harry Kirchner, who I didn't know then, and said, most of your books are fiction, and this one is nonfiction, and it's got footnotes or endnotes and a bibliography, and it's got an index, and if we can't change the pagination, because then the whole thing has to be re-indexed, and nobody wants to do that, and nobody could without Rick. And I thought that what Harry would say, I didn't know him, I thought what Harry would say is, well, it's just not going to work for us because we have to mush our books into this shape that is how we make them. And instead he said, well, we're going to have to break the template sometime. We might as well break it now because we really want to publish this book. So, and it was just, it was, you know, Jonathan's column was the first bolt of lightning, and this was lightning striking a second time. And it was just so great, and Harry's been terrific to work with. And you know, Charlotte and I hadn't heard of Pharaoh Seditions before this happened, and we hadn't met Renee, and she'd never met Rick, and this whole thing came to be because of Renee, and so she's going to tell you something about that.
Can you hear me okay? The story for me, I'll start one place and go back a bit. Kind of out of the blue, it seemed I got contacted by Harry from Pharos. And one thing I can tell you about Pharos is they're dedicated to bringing lost books back to life. And I believe it's about once a year, Harry can connect it, they pick one author who gets to choose one book to bring back to life. And Harry contacted me, and I was just blown away by this honor. Previous authors that have gotten to do this include Ursula Le Guin and Cheryl Strayed, Lydia, just, you know, so I felt, you know, Jess Walters was another one. So I felt just hugely honored that I was the author that would get to choose a book to bring back to life. But like a lot of authors, I'm a voracious reader. I talk about it a bit in the foreword. From a young age, I've just read, and the library was my sanctuary. I grew up quite poor, and I spent all my time in the library. And so I was kind of struck with this as a huge honor, but immediately all these books that are out of print now kind of started flashing in my mind. And I thought it's a huge honor, but it's also like having the magic wand. And out of all the books you could pick, you have to pick one. I talk a bit in the foreword about, as a child, spending all my time in the library. I spent most of my time in the North Portland Library. For those of you that know, it's right near Jefferson High School. It's got this beautiful wood-paneled ceiling. And I have these vivid memories of surrounding myself with stacks of books. And like many children of that era, I was obsessed with what we called Indians. And I read every book I could on Native Americans. Years later, having gone through a lot of tough times growing up, I became a writer. And as was mentioned, one of my mentors was Catherine Dunn, who always encouraged me to become a writer and to follow my passion. And actually, you know, sometime into our friendship, I think soon after this book came out, Catherine knew about my history, and she knew, I think I told her about my childhood fascination with the Indians. And she passed me a copy of this book. And I think I met Rick in passing at one of like her Christmas parties. But I hadn't ever met Rick, didn't know him. I had heard of him a great deal. And I read this book, and I was just blown away. I mean, this is just a profoundly important book. This is a book that talks about a history in Oregon that nobody else has written about. This is a one-of-a-kind book. It's just an immensely special book. And it's not just special, it's important. And as soon as I read it, I remember thinking, this book should be taught in every school, in every college. Every kid should grow up reading this book. Not just in Oregon, but the Pacific Northwest, and pretty much any place. So as I, had my magic wand, and I spent a lot of time after getting contacted by Harry, which book do I pick? I just kept going back to my bookshelf and looking at this book. And, I just knew this had to be the book. I also knew that Pharos in general usually does fiction, as was mentioned. So I kind of wondered, what if I pick this nonfiction book? What'll happen? And Harry was just so incredibly accommodating. And the minute I said, this is the book, I have to say it just made me feel really good, because it is such an important book. And I'm just so happy to be here, and I've been so honored to meet Charlotte, and to get to know this person that wrote this book that was so special to me, because that's such a part of reading and writing is behind every book there's a storyteller. And now I feel like, in a way, I got to know Rick as well, and that's been a very special thing for me. So I'm the one person, though, that showed up having forgotten to bring her reading copy. So I borrowed my copy, somebody else, another copy of the book, and I was going to read something from the back. Let's see. This is, it's a little sad, but sometimes the truth is sad, and this is part of the story. So I thought I'd read a little bit of something about the end of the story of this particular people, this particular part of history that is our history as well, for those of us here in Oregon. It is almost certainly malaria that the Chinook died of, that feverish malady of the fetid tropics, since recognized as the most important of all infectious diseases. Fever was the name commonly used in 19th century America to describe the disease that for a while would be called miasma and finally malaria. Its cause was unknown until 1897. Though it is most frequent in the tropics, malaria does strike among northerly regions. Further, when a virulent strain attacks people totally lacking in acquired immunity, it can kill a high proportion, as it did in Russia in 1992, when 6 million died. Malaria would continue in small numbers in Western Oregon for the next century. Outbreaks were common in Portland and Willamette Valley until 1930. When the mosquito carrying it, the malaria's only means of transmission, was sufficiently reduced by public health measures to eliminate transmission. And the book goes on to talk about the utter devastation and the loss of humanity for this area, which was once so incredibly populated by the Chinook, and how very few remained. As for the survivors, almost everyone they knew was dead. Noble and slave, feared conjurer, and lowly boy with running sores, all dead. Their language became painful, if not impossible to speak, so they stopped speaking it. The Shorewater took to speaking Chehalis, the Clatsop spoke jargon or Tillamook. Their culture became unsewed, untied, unplugged, and unglued. The survivors wandered off, demented by the incomprehensible tragedy that had overwhelmed them. On April 3rd, 1835, they recorded Asogi Island. Immortality is carried off to a man its inhabitants, and there's nothing to attest that they ever existed, except their decaying houses, their graves, and their unburied bones, of which there are heaps. They were gone, simply gone, and lucky to be so. What Chinook, immersed in relationships, would choose to live when everyone he knew was gone? They may have shrieked and howled in their dying agony, but the dead were fortunate. The survivors knew they were doomed. Nothing could protect them. They had no reason to expect tomorrow to dawn or themselves to be alive to see it. They did not seem to care very much. They only built little houses. Thank you.
For decades, Rick was a working journalist. He probably most significantly was a contributor to the Oregonian. Northwest Magazine was a beautiful place for him to place his work. It was read by more than 500,000 people in its heyday. And he kind of was there as it was in its last years, but his pieces in the Northwest Magazine, which was the rotogravure section of the Oregonian, were rich and wonderful. He went into the maritime trade, the world of outsiders. He portrayed them beautifully, whether they were a native, a community of Bohemians down in Takilma near Grants Pass. He really caught the flavor of this place, and those stories were things that people look forward to seeing. He was also a contributor to Willamette Week, Clinton Street Quarterly, a whole lot of other publications that were doing the same kind of thing in a formal magazine way. And I think that his best writing, also the Northwest Examiner, Northwest Neighbor, published a whole lot of things, some of them rants But he managed to capture again the stories of many, many people here and told them with understanding, compassion, and a lot of intelligence.
Writing was his main thing, and the rest were just ways to to support his writing. But I think he did actually start out doing some PR work, and he found that was very well. That's when he had the MG that was shown in the picture, and just when he was thinking that he was really doing well, and he asked for a raise. The story is that was when they found they just lost a big client and they had to let him go, and that was his experience with actually working on a regular basis for other people. And Rick just really wasn't that kind of a guy, and he got away with it. So yes, he was really a writer. So. Are you asking a question, David? His nephew here. That is true. He did. I'm not sure whether he decided to just go to New York and become a social worker so he could go to Jamaica and write for 6 months, if he had that in mind exactly, but that's the way it worked out. He went to New York and found a job handing out benefits to people that were actually living in better circumstances than he was at the time, because I think he found a 6th floor walk-up or something and saved all of his money, and then went to Jamaica and wrote a book and enjoyed it. Enjoyed Jamaica very much, and then got a sailboat, crewed a sailboat home. That particular book is one of several that never got very far, not like this book, but he certainly had a good time doing it. So that was.
I just want to say, so as someone whose book has been resurrected by Harry, I'm so grateful, and I'm so struck by us all coming out through the rain to celebrate Naked Against the Rain. And the passage Renee read, the Chinook people are here. And the little house they lived in is this book. And it takes a village to make a book. And I'm just so grateful for everyone in this room and the people who made it.
Thank you, Kim.